So thank you, Team Fast Forward, for an amazing conference. It's such a privilege to be here. So I'm a photography curator and photo historian. And over the last sort of 15 years or so, I've been investigating the ways in which gendered roles and assumptions shape women's photographic practice, particularly in relation to war and conflict. And I just kind of wanted to make clear here that I'm talking here about gender as a culturally constructed category rather than something which is innate. As we are all very familiar, war photography is conventionally assumed to be a masculine endeavour undertaken by risk-taking photojournalists in the combat zone. And of course, with some notable exceptions, some of whom are here with us today, women have historically faced constraints to participating in this mode. However, if we take a much broader conception of war photography, we begin to see a different picture. So in my work, I've been considering the wider panorama, the ways in which women not just make, but also collect, publish, view and share images arising from situations of armed conflict, and working in different kind of photographic idioms as well. And if we do that, we find that women have persistently taken part. So the book that you can see here, Photography in War, I guess this has kind of been one of my strategies, and this is a revisionist account of war photography. It's an expanded view, not of the genre that we're all familiar with, but of the many and complex interactions between photography and war, including things like military visioning technologies, propaganda, protest, aftermath, art, photography, snapshots, and so on. And in this book, I really tried to be more representative of experiences of conflict. And there are about 120 illustrations in this book, actually, which I have a copy here if you want to have a look later. Of the named identified photographers in this book, about half are by women, which is really unusual for a book which doesn't claim to be a gendered history. So in that sense, that was the kind of revisionist statement I wanted to make. And I should just say, actually, it does feature some of the photographers that we've heard from this conference. So Susan, Melanie and Janan all feature in the book, so thank you for that. Okay. So I've explored women's photography in lots of different contexts. This is some work that I did on what's the first serious research on Elizabeth Beachbard, who was an ambrotypist who made portraits of Confederate soldiers in the American Civil War, 1861. So she was a portrait photographer and had a wooden cabin actually in a military camp in rural Louisiana. So she is, I would argue, the first named identified US female photographer of war. She actually died in the military camp as well, making her perhaps the first to also lose her life in that endeavour as well. And just thinking back to Janan yesterday when you were talking about the tray and the reattribution of the V&A, I had a similar little victory here in that through my research there's only two, there were thought to be only these two surviving ambrotypes, and in my research I've discovered a third one. And it's in the American Civil War Museum in Richmond, Virginia, and they've changed the attribution, so I'm really kind of gratified about that. And another large project I did was No Man's Land, which was during the centenary of the First World War, where I curated the first exhibition in the UK dedicated to women's photography from that conflict. And it brought together photographers, official and amateur, as well as snapshots by ambulance drivers and first aid volunteers. And I was really struck by Neston's presentation. I'm so sad that she's not here, because that was so interesting to see that from the Georgian perspective. And part of this project also included a young people's project where they did their own research and archives and produced an educational book which got distributed free to libraries and schools in the UK. So again, kind of trying to change that narrative really of women's participation and their viewpoints in conflict. But for this paper, I'm going to talk about women's photography in the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920. And I'm going to look at two parallel instances of women's photographic practice. And they are Sara Castrejón, who was a Mexican owner-operator of a small portrait studio in southwestern Mexico. You can see on the right there with the president. And she actually became a sort of semi-official photographer to the occupying troops. And on the left, we've got Kate Leach, who is an American woman who was more of a hobbyist, snapshot photographer. She made photo albums, and she lived in Chihuahua during the Mexican Revolution. And what I want to say is that although both women practiced in photographic genres traditionally configured feminine and apolitical, the family album and the studio portrait, their photographic activities were transformed by war, and they responded to that. I'm drawing on the work of Mexican researcher Samuel Villela, who's done an amazing job of reconstructing the archive of Sara Castrejón, and he published a book in 2010, so that's the centenary of the Mexican Revolution, which has really brought her work to the public kind of attention. So she was from a middle-class family in a provincial town. At the age of 18, she went to Mexico City to do what possibly a studio apprenticeship or had some kind of education at a ladies' school. She returned and established what seems to have been the only photographic business in this quite isolated town. At this time, photographic portraiture was considered to be a suitable occupation for women in Mexico. Although there weren't that many working, it was considered to be something that women were suited to doing. And many of the surviving photographs from Horuva depict subjects that might be expected: family, society portraits, records of weddings and christenings, and so on. However, in 1911, her hometown was invaded by Maderista forces, and this is when her output radically diversified to encompass numerous portraits of military personnel made in her studio, also outside. She did equestrian portraits, she documented encampments, troops staging preparedness of battle, military funerals, the signing of peace accords, as well as executions by firing squad. A really beautiful portrait of a female colonel. Some echoes here of the Nicaragua work, I think, in terms of the women's kind of participation in military roles. So there hasn't been that much critical commentary on Castrejón's work to date, and at most there have been claims that her practice was a feminine one, and as such she displayed an innate empathy with her subject and took pains to create feminine flourishes, such as introducing natural elements like foliage into her portraits. As you can, I don't know if you can see here, the sort of there's a stack of rifles with bayonets at the top, and then the kind of leaves on the bottom of the studio. I don't buy into this essentialist argument, I have to say, and I don't see this as a particularly feminine coded image. I see Castrejón as a very resilient entrepreneur. She was operating within accepted structures for women's professional photography, albeit ones that were stretched in the extraordinary circumstances of war. This portrait of General Fidel Pineda forms a sequence that records a triple execution of Pineda and two associates and ends in a record of the instant fire itself. Castrejón's niece later claimed that she was summoned by army officials to photograph the execution to provide proof of orders carried out. Unfortunately, no diary survives in this case, so we don't know if that's true. But this claim is borne out by the ink stamp you can see on the left-hand side at the General Archive of the Ministry of War and Navy. It's not known if Castrejón received a fee from the military for this job. Of course, if she were ordered, she would have faced considerable pressure to comply. And her photography must have been part of a precarious strategy that required careful negotiation and formation of tactical alliances amongst the multiple factions operating during the revolution. In this image we can see the moment of fire itself. So how come she was able to assume this position? In contrast to the US or parts of Western Europe, camera ownership in Mexico was not extensive at the time of the revolution, and snapshot cameras were used by a very small minority of upper-class users rather than by soldiers or bystanders, as we see in the Western Front in the First World War, for instance. As far as we know, she was the only professional photographer in town. She built a reputation as a reliable photographer, and many of her military portraits were made for repeat customers, demonstrating their satisfaction with her work. So she was an acceptable and logical choice for military personnel wishing to have a photographic evidence of their feats, irrespective of her gender. And it's striking that this image was actually produced as a photographic postcard, in which Castrejón has captioned the image, and she's actually numbered the men at the moment of death and included quite a lot of information about it. So whilst she may have been impelled to make this by military command, she also identified a commercial opportunity to offer the image for general sale as a newsworthy and historic event. So something which maybe complicates some of those assumptions of innate female empathy, but also shows her sense of historical consciousness. What interests me is the way in which her profession as a photographer enabled her to become a public, visible and central figure. So operating a large plate camera using a tripod, she had a male assistant, her brother. She physically occupied these prominent positions, such as this military funeral here, where the proceedings are halted so that she can do her work and all eyes are turned to the photographer. So her images index the ways in which she expanded acceptable geographies for women, moving from the private sphere into the public and military realms. It's perhaps ironic that it was this suitable occupation of photographic portraiture that enabled her to broker centrality and authority. Rather than witnessing from the sidelines, her images register a woman at the centre of events, in possession of a commanding and valued gaze. By contrast, Kate Leach was very much a hobbyist photographer. She was one of a number of US women who recorded their experiences of the Mexican Revolution, and through my primary research I've come across quite a number of these women. There's still very little written on this subject. This one comes from the Hayranson Research Center in Texas. So she was married to a manager of an American lumber company, and in 1911 the family relocated to Chihuahua in northwestern Mexico. And her albums contain a real kind of hodgepodge of imagery. We've got photographic postcards, commercial panoramic prints, some snapshots by Leach. They're all kind of united through her narrative and her distinctive handwritten captions. She certainly wasn't a professional photographer or even a keen amateur, but someone who engaged with photography primarily for its ability to keep records and tell stories and chronicle lives. Traditionally, album making has been seen as a gendered practice with antecedents in pre-photographic pastimes such as quilt making, autograph albums, scrapbooks and genealogical family bibles, and they've often been assumed, or at least historically have been assumed to be rather trivial, inward-looking, and severed from the public political sphere, which you can see in this double-page spread here. So we've got on the left-hand side, we've got her daughter Annette, and on the right there's a pair of ladders up against a pine tree with a humorous caption, "Martin, remember the cat." But these images sit cheek by jowl with photographs that depict the unfolding Mexican Revolution. So we've got images on the left here, a group of Maderista women, on the right, national troops. These are professionally made photographs, presumably available to buy commercially, that she bought and collected. Her albums also include images of bombed buildings, of wrecked trains, battle-wounded Mexican officials, as well as the shell fire of Juárez, the Battle of Juárez, more typical of coded masculine news reportage. This panoramic view is probably a professional image that she acquired, and a view taken from the top of the American National Bank building, El Paso, Texas, during the second day of the Battle of Juárez. Exploding shells from the federal cannon noted in foothills, some shown as 2 light spots. So although she didn't take the image herself, her caption incorporates it into her own narrative, reflecting her knowledge of events, and this is something she did throughout her albums. And it's worth reflecting that at this time that Leach was making her album, it was a time of pivotal change for women in the US. It was the progressive era. We saw transformations in women's social status. Although full suffrage was not granted to US women until 1920, they increasingly entered the professions, travelled and lived independently. And meanwhile, snapshot photography was becoming increasingly popular due to George Eastman's Kodak camera, launched in 1888. which was a cheap and simple to operate camera, so photography was no longer the preserve of professionals like in Sara Castrejón across the border. Snapshot photography was a socially acceptable hobby for women and even a desirable marker of modern femininity. So this is an example of the Kodak Girl marketing campaign run by Kodak, which was launched in 1893. And she was this kind of lively and cosmopolitan woman who's pictured out, photographing, very nicely dressed, often kind of having picnics or on these road trips, creating a positive image of a female photographic observer roaming and recording the wider world. And the copy on this advert states, "It's always interesting, it's personal. It tells of the places, the people and incidents from your own point of view." And I just want to highlight how radical that must have been, that women telling of their experiences from their own point of view with their own photographs. So seen within this context, Leach was, as a young middle-class US woman travelling abroad, certainly operated within some existing conventions and choosing to record her experiences via snapshots. But as we can see from her images, they contrasted sharply with the romanticised scenarios of the Kodak Girl. So this image comes from a sequence recording the journey made by the Leach family going from Ciudad Juárez to Ciudad Madera in 1911, at the time that rebels had seized controls of portions of Chihuahua. And I don't know if you can see from this slide, but there's kind of this really scrawled red handwritten script all around it that describes the kind of hour-by-hour events, the proximity to the revolution. They were journeying with the rebel payload and the insurrecto soldiers. So she presents herself as a participant, an active observer who's kind of strayed into this terrain of conflict. Occasionally her own opinion emerges. This photograph here shows military personnel, Colonel Roque Gonzalez Garza, a Maderista, and Giuseppe Garibaldi, who's the grandson of the Italian general. But beyond these statements of fact, what stands out is Leach's own acerbic comment on Gonzalez Garza. Quote, "Most important figure of entire revolution," brackets, "in his own estimation." It's not clear whether Leach formed her critical opinion through an actual encounter or second-hand, but what is striking is that despite the asymmetry of power relations between the disenfranchised civilian woman and a politically powerful military man, Leach confidently exercises her right to express disapproval, albeit within the private pages of her album. It should be noted, however, that whilst Kate Leach is in some senses an appealing figure in terms of reclaiming women's histories, her albums are not unproblematic, and class and race certainly come into this. So I'm certainly not suggesting that women's cultural work is superior to that of their male peers. Like them, women travellers and chroniclers reproduced cultural, racial and class stereotypes that reflected US imperialist and capitalist concerns, as you can see here in this image of native. To conclude, Castrejón and Leach are just two women from this period who worked in photographic genres traditionally configured feminine and apolitical, the studio portrait and the family album. Yet they're very emblematic of the ways in which women's photographic activities are radically inflected by war. The two women actively sought photographic means through which to engage with, comment upon and record their experiences of the revolution. And rather than be positioned as bystanders to war, Castrejón and Leach produced images and artefacts that make the viewpoints of women central, emblematic of ways in which women participated in the Mexican Revolution more widely. Thank you.